You're out of line, Reed. Know your place. The words cut across the training yard so sharply that even the morning wind seemed to stop. 42 recruits stood frozen in two straight rows beneath the pale gray sky of Raleigh, North Carolina, their boots planted on the cold pavement, their breath rising in thin white clouds. No one moved. No one wanted to be the first person to react. At the center of the yard stood Lieutenant Marcus Reed, a black officer with 14 years on the force, a clean uniform, a clipboard in one hand, and the kind of calm that did not beg for attention because it had already earned respect. 3 feet in front of him, Officer Travis Boone pointed a stiff finger toward Marcus's chest, his jaw tight, his voice loud enough for every recruit to hear. I said you're out of line. The sentence hung there, ugly and deliberate, wrapped in something colder than discipline. It was not just disagreement. Everyone felt it. It was the way Boone said Reed, as if the name itself bothered him. It was the way his eyes moved over Marcus's uniform but refused to recognize the rank on it. It was the way he looked around at the recruits afterward, expecting them to understand that this was how power worked. But Marcus did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not step back. He simply looked at Boone with a steady expression, the kind of look that made anger feel childish. Behind them, the flag above the academy building snapped softly in the wind. Somewhere near the entrance, a radio crackled and then went quiet. The security camera on the corner of the brick building turned slowly, catching every face, every pause, every breath held too long. The training session had been scheduled as a lesson on discipline under pressure, the first real test for the new class. They were supposed to learn how an officer should respond when emotions rose, when people shouted, when pride begged to take control. But none of the recruits expected the lesson to begin like this. Not with one officer trying to embarrass another in front of them. Not with a white cop using the word discipline like a shield for disrespect. Not with a black lieutenant being told to know his place on a yard where he had been assigned to lead. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly to the clipboard, then looked back at Boone. His voice came quiet, even, almost too controlled for the moment. Officer Boone, I am exactly where the chief assigned me to be. A few recruits glanced at one another. That sentence did not sound like a comeback. It sounded like a record being made. Boone gave a short laugh, but it landed flat. He wanted Marcus angry. He wanted a scene. He wanted proof that the man in front of him did not belong in command. Instead, Marcus turned slightly toward the recruits and said, remember what you feel right now. The tightness in your chest. The urge to look away. The pressure to pretend this is normal. This is where discipline begins. And for the first time that morning, the recruits stopped looking at Boone. They looked at Marcus. The training yard remained silent long enough for the lesson to change shape. What had started as a scheduled morning exercise had become something heavier, something every recruit could feel, but no one had words for yet. The academy building stood behind them in red brick and glass, its windows reflecting the rows of uniforms like a quiet witness. It was 7:18 in the morning, cold enough for hands to stiffen around notebooks, cold enough for the steel whistle hanging from Marcus Reed's neck to feel like ice against his chest. The recruits had arrived expecting rules, formations, commands, maybe a stern lecture about procedure. Instead, they were watching the difference between control and character unfold in front of them. Marcus let the silence breathe. He knew silence made some people uncomfortable because it refused to protect them from what they had just said. Officer Travis Boone shifted his weight, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement. He was used to filling space with volume. He was used to men moving when he barked, to younger officers lowering their eyes when he stared too long, to mistakes being hidden under the word toughness. For almost 19 years, Boone had built a reputation as the kind of officer who did not bend. Some called him old school. Some called him strict. Others, usually when he was not in the room, called him dangerous in the small ways that paperwork rarely captured. A comment here, a smirk there, a recruit singled out too often, a civilian spoken to like a problem before they became a person. Marcus knew that kind of officer. Every department had one, sometimes more than one. Men who believed the badge made their instincts holy. Men who confused fear with respect because fear was easier to demand. But this morning was not about Boone alone. That was what Marcus understood before anyone else did. This was about the 42 recruits watching him. This was about the habits they would carry into traffic stops, domestic calls, grocery store complaints, school hallways, apartment parking lots, and late-night situations where one impatient decision could break a family's trust forever. Marcus turned fully toward the class. His expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp enough to hold every recruit in place. "The first rule of pressure," he said, "is that it shows you what you practiced before the moment arrived." No one wrote it down at first. Then one recruit near the second row lifted her pen. Emma Collins, 24 years old, from Greensboro, raised by a school nurse mother and a father who drove city buses for 30 years without one citizen complaint. Emma had joined the academy because she believed police work could still mean service, not intimidation. She had been watching Boone since the session began. The clipped tone, the way he interrupted, the way he seemed offended that Marcus did not ask permission to lead. Now she wrote quickly in the margin of her notebook, "Pressure shows practice." Boone noticed her writing and frowned, as if even the act of recording Marcus's words felt like betrayal. Marcus saw that too. He saw everything. That was why Chief Harold Bennett had chosen him for this class. Not because Marcus was loud, not because he was perfect, because Marcus had spent years proving that restraint was not weakness, that dignity did not disappear just because someone tried to provoke it, and that the hardest command any officer would ever give was the one given silently to himself. Marcus did not. Begin with Boone. That was what made the moment uncomfortable for everyone who expected punishment to arrive quickly and loudly. He looked past the officer in front of him and focused on the recruits, because they were the reason the morning mattered. "When you wear this uniform," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the yard without strain, "people will sometimes give you compliance before they give you trust. Do not confuse the two." The words moved through the class slowly. A few recruits looked down at their boots, as if something in that sentence had found them before they were ready. Emma Collins kept writing. She could feel that this was no ordinary lecture. This was the kind of lesson her father had warned her about when she told him she wanted to become an officer. He had not tried to stop her, but he had looked at her across their kitchen table and said, "The job will test whether you want to help people or control them. Know the answer before the street asks you." Now, standing in the cold air with her pen trembling slightly between her fingers, Emma understood what he meant. Marcus turned and picked up a small stack of laminated scenario cards from a folding table near the center of the yard. The table held training radios, blank citation forms, a plastic clipboard, and a row of orange cones used to mark imaginary streets and sidewalks. Everything looked ordinary. That was the point. Most moments that changed a life did not begin with flashing lights or dramatic warnings. They began with an ordinary call, an ordinary misunderstanding, an ordinary officer deciding whether to slow down or push harder. Marcus held up the first card. "Scenario 1, he said. "A resident is filming you from 12 feet away during a noise complaint. He is angry. He is loud. He says he does not trust police. What is your first responsibility?" A recruit in the front row answered, "Maintain scene safety, sir." Marcus nodded. "Good. What else?" Another recruit said, "Communicate clearly." Marcus nodded again. "What else?" The yard went quiet. Boone crossed his arms. "Take command," he said, loud enough to reclaim attention. "That is the answer everyone keeps dancing around. You take command before the situation takes command of you." Marcus looked at him. Not angry, not surprised, just watching. "And what does command look like, Officer Boone?" Boone almost smiled, as though the question had been a gift. "It looks like control. Firm voice. Clear orders. No tolerance for disrespect." Marcus let that sit there. Then he turned back to the recruits. "That answer is common," he said. "It is also incomplete." Boone's face tightened. Marcus continued before he could interrupt. "Command is not the same as domination. A firm voice without listening becomes noise. Clear orders without lawful purpose become ego. And disrespect from a citizen does not give an officer permission to forget the Constitution." The recruits were still now, not because they were afraid, but because the words had weight. Somewhere above them, the camera continued its slow turn. Boone saw it then. He glanced at the building, at the dark glass window on the second floor, at the small black dome under the awning. His confidence flickered for less than a second. Marcus saw that too, but he did not chase it. He had learned a long time ago that truth did not need to run after anyone. It only needed to be placed where everyone could see it. Boone did not like being corrected in front of recruits. He had built too much of himself around being the man others did not question, and Marcus had questioned him with calm, which was worse than anger because calm gave Boone nothing to fight without revealing himself. The yard seemed to narrow around him. 42 recruits. One lieutenant. One camera. One moment slipping out of his hands. He cleared his throat and took half a step toward the folding table, pretending to study the scenario cards as if he had planned this shift all along. You can dress it up however you want, Boone said, forcing a hard smile. But out on the street, people do not care about your classroom language. They care about who is in charge. Marcus placed the laminated card back on the table with care. People care about whether authority is lawful, professional, and fair. Boone gave a short breath through his nose. That sounds good in a seminar. Marcus turned toward him. It sounds better in a complaint review when an officer made the right choice under pressure. The words were not loud, but several recruits looked up. Complaint review. The phrase carried a different kind of weight in an academy yard. It reminded everyone that every decision could be replayed, questioned, written down, investigated, and remembered by people who were not standing there when pride made the choice feel easy. Boone's eyes moved again to the camera, then away. Emma Collins saw it. She wrote nothing this time. She just watched. Boone reached for a different card. Let us try a real scenario then, he said. A person refuses a lawful order. He is recording you, insulting you, telling you that you are a bad officer, trying to embarrass you in front of a crowd. What do? He looked around at the recruits as if daring them to answer Marcus's way. No one spoke. Boone nodded, satisfied. Exactly. You shut it down. Marcus stepped closer, not enough to crowd him, only enough that his voice could drop. No. You slow it down. Boone's face hardened. That is why people think this department has gone soft. There it was. The word he had been circling all morning. Soft. He said it like an accusation, like compassion was a weakness, like patience was a failure, like respecting a person's rights was something to be ashamed of. Marcus looked at the recruits again. Soft is not staying calm, he said. Soft is needing disrespect to prove you have power. Soft is losing control and calling it command. Soft is forgetting that a person can be angry, scared, wrong, loud, confused, or disrespectful and still have rights. A quiet shift moved through the class. It was not dramatic. It was not applause. It was something more useful. Understanding. Boone felt it and hated it. His voice rose before he could stop it. You think these kids need a speech from you about rights? They need to learn what happens when people do not comply. Marcus held his gaze. They need to learn what happens when officers do not think. The sentence landed clean. Not cruel. Not personal. Clean. Boone's mouth opened, but no answer came quickly enough. For the first time that morning, the man who had tried to make Marcus look small looked smaller himself. Not because anyone had humiliated him, but because his own words had finally run out of places to hide. Then the glass door of the academy building opened behind them, and every recruit heard the steady sound of polished shoes crossing the pavement. Chief Harold Bennett stepped onto the training yard without rushing, and somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. He was a tall man in his late 50s, silver hair cut close, uniform pressed with the kind of care that made rank look less like decoration and more like responsibility. Beside him walked Sergeant Daniel Price from Internal Affairs, carrying a slim black folder under one arm. No one said the folder mattered, but everyone looked at it. Boone looked at it twice. The sound of their shoes against the pavement seemed louder than the wind. Marcus did not turn fully toward them at first. He kept his posture straight, his hands relaxed, his expression unchanged, as if he had known this part of the morning would arrive exactly when it needed to. Chief Bennett stopped several feet from the class and allowed his eyes to move across the rows of recruits before settling on Boone. Officer Boone, he said, step back into formation. Boone blinked. The instruction was simple, almost quiet, but it reached every corner of the yard. Chief, I was only clarifying the training standard, Boone said. His voice had changed. It no longer carried the same sharp confidence. It had edges now, but the center was hollow. Chief Bennett did not raise his voice. The training standard was assigned before this class began. He turned slightly toward Marcus. Lieutenant Reed was designated as lead instructor for discipline under pressure at 6:30 this morning. You acknowledged the assignment in writing at 6:42. The words were precise. Time-stamped. Undeniable. Emma Collins felt the hair on her arms lift beneath her jacket. This was not a sudden rescue. This was documentation. This was the quiet machinery of accountability beginning to move. Boone's mouth tightened. I had concerns about his approach. Chief Bennett held his gaze. Concerns are brought through the chain of command. They are not performed in front of recruits. The yard went still again, but this silence was different from the first one. Earlier, the silence had protected Boone. Now it exposed him. Sergeant Price opened the black folder and removed a single page. He did not hand it to anyone yet. He just held it in both hands, eyes lowered, as if waiting for the chief's signal. Boone saw the page and swallowed. Marcus saw that too, but his expression did not change. Chief Bennett looked toward the recruits. Class, what you witnessed this morning is not a distraction from the lesson. It is the lesson. No one moved. Authority does not become legitimate because it is loud. It becomes legitimate when it is lawful, accountable, and disciplined. Boone shifted in place. His face had gone red, not with rage now, but with the discomfort of a man realizing that volume had carried him into a room where facts were already waiting. Chief Bennett turned back to him. Officer Boone, you will join the line. Boone stared at him. Sir, you will join the line, the chief repeated. Lieutenant Reed will continue leading this session. For a moment, the only sound was the flag above the building snapping in the cold air. Then Boone moved. Slowly, stiffly, he stepped away from the center of the yard and walked toward the end of the second row, where the newest recruit stood. No one smiled. No one laughed. Marcus would not have allowed it, and somehow they all knew that. This was not revenge. This was something far more difficult for Boone to face. It was discipline without humiliation, consequence without cruelty, accountability without a crowd being invited to enjoy his fall. Marcus waited until Boone took his place. Then he turned back to the class and said, Now we continue. Marcus let the line settle before he spoke again. He did not look at Boone first. He looked at the recruits, because the lesson had never belonged to one man's pride. Take out your notebooks, he said. The sound came in pieces, paper shifting, pens clicking, gloves brushing against jacket sleeves. Boone stood at the far end of the second row, shoulders tight, eyes fixed. Forward as if still trying to convince himself he had not been moved there in front of everyone. Chief Bennett remained near the edge of the yard with Sergeant Price, silent now, not interfering, not rescuing the class from the discomfort of learning something real. Marcus picked up a marker and walked to the portable whiteboard near the cones. Across the top, he wrote one sentence in block letters. What does power make easier to hide? He stepped aside so everyone could see it. The question looked simple, but it seemed to pull the air tighter around them. Do not answer fast, Marcus said. Fast answers are usually the ones we use to protect ourselves. Emma Collins stared at the board. Around her, recruits shifted. Some frowned. Some lowered their eyes. One young man in the front row finally raised his hand. Anger, sir. Marcus nodded. Yes, power can hide anger because people may be too afraid to name it. Another recruit said, Fear. Marcus turned to him. Explain. The recruit swallowed. An officer might act hard because he is scared to look uncertain. Marcus nodded again. Good. Fear becomes dangerous when it dresses itself as authority. The words landed carefully, but they landed. A third recruit said, Insecurity. A fourth said, Bad judgment. Emma raised her hand slowly. Marcus saw her. Collins. She straightened. Bias, sir. The yard went quiet. Not because the word was surprising, but because it was honest. Boone's jaw tightened at the end of the row. Emma continued, her voice controlled but not soft. Power can hide bias because people can call it instinct, or experience, or procedure. They can make it sound professional even when it is personal. No one moved. Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. That is an answer worth remembering. Boone looked away. For a second, Marcus saw something pass across his face that was not anger. It was recognition, unwanted and unfinished. Marcus turned toward him. Officer Boone. Boone's eyes snapped back. Yes, Lieutenant. The title came out stiff, but it came out. Your answer. The entire class seemed to hold its breath. Boone looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Chief Bennett. He looked at Sergeant Price and the folder under his arm. Then he looked at Marcus. A dozen possible answers fought behind his eyes, but none of them could save him from the question. For once, a loud answer would not help. Several seconds passed. The wind moved across the pavement. Finally, Boone said, Power can hide what you already decided about someone before they speak. His voice was lower than before. Not healed, not humble, but cracked open just enough for truth to pass through. Marcus did not smile. He did not praise him like a child. He simply nodded once. "That is where discipline begins," he said. "Not when everyone agrees with you. Not when people obey you. It begins the moment you recognize the story you wrote about someone before you gave them the dignity of being known." Marcus turned away from the whiteboard and walked slowly along the front of the formation, not like a man inspecting recruits, but like a teacher making sure the lesson had reached every person standing there. "Every call you answer will ask you two questions," he said. "The first is what is happening. The second is what are you bringing into it?" No one wrote for a moment. They listened. Even Boone listened, though his face remained guarded and his shoulders still carried the stiffness of someone used to being corrected without being attacked. Marcus stopped near the row of orange cones marking the edge of the mock sidewalk. "A uniform does not erase your history," he continued. "It does not erase your fears, your pride, your family stories, your bad days, your old assumptions, or the things you were taught before you knew how to question them. The uniform only gives you a responsibility to examine all of that before it touches another person's life." Emma Collins felt the sentence settle somewhere deep. She thought of her father driving his bus through Raleigh traffic for 3 decades, greeting passengers who ignored him, calming arguments without a badge, helping elderly riders step down safely in the rain, learning names because names made people harder to dismiss. He had authority too, just not the kind people saluted. Marcus pointed toward the first cone. "Collins, step forward." Emma moved quickly, standing beside the marked line. Marcus handed her a scenario card. "You are the responding officer. The call is a disturbance outside a small grocery store. A man is upset because the clerk accused his teenage son of stealing. The clerk wants him removed. The father is loud. He is pointing. Several people are filming. What do you do first?" Emma looked down at the card, then back up. Boone watched her with the faint skepticism of a man waiting for theory to fail. Emma took a breath. "I create space, sir. I identify myself. I ask what happened. I do not start with blame." Marcus nodded. "Keep going. I check whether anyone is in immediate danger. If not, I slow the scene down. I speak to the father and the clerk separately if possible. I remember that being loud does not automatically mean being dangerous." The words were careful, but they grew steadier as she spoke. Marcus looked toward Boone. "Officer Boone, what did Recruit Collins do that mattered?" Boone's eyes narrowed slightly. For a second, pride tried to close the door again. Then he looked at the cones, at Emma, at the recruits watching him, and maybe at the invisible weight of the folder still held by Sergeant Price. "She did not let the volume decide the facts," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Exactly." The class felt the shift. Small. Real. Not forgiveness. Not resolution. A shift. Chief Bennett stepped forward then, his voice calm but final. "That is why Lieutenant Reed was assigned to lead this session." He looked at Boone, not with cruelty, but with the disappointment of a leader who had hoped not to need the file in Sergeant Price's hands. Because discipline is not proven by how quickly you can take control of someone else. It is proven by how honestly you can take control of yourself. Boone lowered his eyes for the first time that morning. Not far, not long, but enough for the yard to notice. And in that small lowering, the recruits saw something more useful than a punishment. They saw a man confronted by the mirror he had avoided, and a lieutenant who refused to turn that mirror into a weapon. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, but the yard no longer felt like a place where recruits were simply learning procedure. It felt like a room without walls where every person had been asked to look inward before looking outward. Marcus moved through 3 more scenarios, each one ordinary enough to happen on any shift in any American city. A teenager sitting on a curb after a shoplifting accusation. A mother upset during a traffic stop because she was late to pick up her child from school. An elderly veteran confused outside a pharmacy, embarrassed and defensive because he could not remember where he parked. None of the scenarios required force. They required patience. They required questions. They required the officer to see more than the first emotion placed in front of him. Each time, Marcus asked the recruits to name the human need behind the behavior. Fear, shame, exhaustion, protection, confusion. Boone stood in the line and answered only when called on, but something in him had stopped pushing back against every word. It did not mean he had changed completely. Real change rarely arrives with music and applause. Sometimes it arrives as discomfort that refuses to leave. Sometimes it begins with a man hearing his own habits described clearly enough that he can no longer pretend they are strength. Near the end of the session, Sergeant Price finally stepped forward with the black folder. Chief Bennett gave a small nod. Price opened it and read in a steady voice, not to shame Boone, but to establish the truth. Effective immediately, Officer Travis Boone is removed from Academy instructional duties pending administrative review. Previous conduct complaints related to training behavior and professionalism will be reopened for evaluation. Officer Boone will complete leadership ethics, de-escalation, and bias recognition training before any future assignment involving recruits is considered. The words were formal, but they struck the yard with quiet force. Boone stared straight ahead. His face was tense, but he did not argue. Not this time. Chief Bennett looked at the recruits. "This is not entertainment," he said. "This is not a fall for you to enjoy. This is what accountability looks like when a department decides its standards mean something even when the person being corrected wears the same uniform." Marcus let that sentence stand. He knew the recruits needed it. Too many people thought accountability was betrayal. Too many officers had been taught that loyalty meant silence. But real loyalty, the kind that protects a community and a department at the same time, requires courage to correct what is wrong before it becomes someone else's trauma. Emma Collins wrote that down almost word for word. Boone looked at Marcus then. There was no apology yet. Maybe he was not ready. Maybe he did not know how to offer one without feeling smaller. Marcus did not demand it. He only met his eyes, steady and human, refusing to reduce Boone to his worst moment even after Boone had tried to do exactly that to him. Then Marcus turned back to the whiteboard and underlined the question one final time. What does power make easier to hide? Your answer to this question, he said, will follow you longer than your badge number. Make sure it is one you can live with. By the time Marcus dismissed the class, the sun had climbed above the academy roofline and turned the cold pavement a pale silver. The recruits did not scatter the way new recruits usually did after a difficult session. They moved slowly, quietly, folding their notebooks, adjusting their gloves, looking at the whiteboard as if the question written there had followed them out of formation and into themselves. What does power make easier to hide? Emma Collins closed her notebook last. On the final line of the page, beneath everything Marcus had said, she wrote one sentence for herself. Discipline is respect under pressure. She did not know it yet, but years later, on a hard call outside a gas station, with a frightened teenager yelling and a crowd filming from 6 feet away, that sentence would come back to her before fear could speak first. It would make her lower her voice. It would make her listen. It would keep a bad moment from becoming a permanent wound. That was how real lessons survived. Not in ceremonies. Not in speeches. In the quiet second when someone chooses to remember. Across the yard, Boone stood alone near the second row, no longer surrounded by the authority he had tried to perform. Sergeant Price waited beside the walkway, the black folder held flat against his side. Chief Bennett spoke to Boone in a low voice, not for the class to hear, not for humiliation, but for record and responsibility. Boone nodded once. Then again. His face still carried pride, but it also carried something heavier now, the burden of being seen clearly. Marcus watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of tired hope. He had been in the job long enough to know that accountability did not guarantee transformation. Some people learned. Some only complied. Some apologized with words and never changed their habits. But a department that refused to correct its own people was a department teaching the worst officers that silence was permission. And silence, Marcus knew, could become policy if enough good people mistook it for loyalty. Chief Bennett eventually walked over to him. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. The wind tugged lightly at the edges of the whiteboard. You handled that better than most would have, Bennett said. Marcus looked toward the emptying yard. I handled it the way I wish more people had handled things when I was coming up. Bennett nodded, the kind of nod that carried regret without making excuses. Marcus picked up the marker and erased the board slowly, but the question did not feel erased. It felt planted. As he capped the marker, Emma passed nearby and paused just long enough to say, Thank you, Lieutenant. Marcus gave her a small nod. Carry it right, he said. She understood. The badge, the lesson, the responsibility, all of it. And long after the yard emptied, long after Boone walked inside to face the review he could no longer avoid, That morning remained in the academy like an echo. He had tried to put Marcus in his place. Instead, Marcus showed everyone that place was never decided by prejudice, rank, or volume. It was decided by character. He thought discipline meant control. That morning, the whole class learned it meant humanity.